be like everything comes out. Oh, recording, that's right. Um, in brain terms, this would be like everything comes out exactly how you want. So I always say to students in particular, this would be like going into your lesson, playing or singing so well that your teacher says, that was amazing. Literally, I have nothing to say. See you next week, which we all know will never ever happen. But that's what we aim for, right? That we just do so amazingly that we blow our teachers away and they're speechless. So, if you imagine your friends faced with these two essentially equal pathways, they don't know which is which, right? They're gonna have to guess. So some of your friends will decide, "Hey, that pathway on the right looks good," and they'll end up at the party. Other of your friends will decide, "I think I'm gonna take the pathway on the left," and unfortunately, they'll end up at the dirty socks. In brain terms, if you have two essentially equal pathways, it basically means that you have a 50-50 shot of it going the way you want it to. And I don't know about you guys, but when I get up on stage to perform a 50-50 shot, that doesn't feel good at all. That feels like so unbelievably nerve-wracking, right? It could be amazing, or it could be like the most embarrassing thing ever. When I get up on stage to perform, what I want is this, right? One pathway I can trust that, yes, I can play this. I'm confident in my ability to do it. It feels consistent, feels solid. I feel good. So the way that you accomplish this one pathway with your friends is you get out your shovel and you put snow over the pathway to the dirty socks so nobody can see it, and then nobody takes that pathway. In terms of your brain, when you have a pathway that's not being used, your brain notices and it dismantles it. There's actually a very cool protein tagging system while you're sleeping that your brain tags proteins that are being used or tags pathways that are being used with a specific protein telling your brain, hey, we want this one. Anything without a protein tag, the brain gets rid of. But it only works if you don't use the pathways you don't want, right? Otherwise, it gets that protein tag. It's just such a cool system. So, at this point in the presentation, I like to ask about how people typically practice. So, I want you to raise your hand. You can raise your actual physical hand. You can use the Zoom, like thumbs up button. But I want you to raise your hand if you practice in one of the two following ways that I'm about to describe. So, way number one, you start at the beginning of whatever you're working on, beginning of the piece, beginning of the movement, beginning of the section, beginning of whatever, and you play until you make a mistake. You fix your mistake, then you go on till you find another one, fix your mistake, go on till you find another one. I call this the treasure hunt method of practicing. So if that sounds like you, raise your hand or use the thumbs up button. I'll scroll through um, people here. See if I see. Okay, I see a couple thumbs up, couple hands. All right. Okay, so that's way number one. Way number two, again, you start at the beginning of whatever, and you go until you make a mistake, and then you start over again, and you try to do it your second time without that mistake. So raise your hand if that sounds like you. So I see some hands, some nodding heads. Okay, great. I'm actually glad that I don't see more hands and nodding heads because both of these ways of practicing are hands down the worst possible ways to practice if you want to get better. If you don't want to get better, you are totally fine. Carry on. But I assume you're practicing because you want to get better, right? If you don't want to get better, like, why are you practicing? But anyways, the reason both of these ways of practicing are so detrimental is because even though you know you've made a mistake, right? In both cases, you play until you make a mistake and then you stop. So clearly you recognize you made a mistake. But you, by making that mistake, you just walk down this pathway to the dirty socks. You just use that pathway, you just reinforce that pathway. And so your brain thinks, oh, we must want this pathway. And you're like, no, please, I don't want it. But your brain doesn't know good from bad pathways. It just knows what you're using. I'm going to say that several times today. Um, and if you use a pathway, your brain thinks that you want it and it's a good one and it's going to keep it. So we need to practice in a way that minimizes going down the wrong pathway and strengthens the pathway that we actually want. It's a little bit beyond the scope of the presentation today to talk about specific practice techniques in terms of like to play in tune, do this, or to play faster, do this. Although if you want to know about playing faster, I have a whole video series on that, so I can put it in the chat later. I do want to mention one specific practice technique though, and I'm also going to put a PDF for you guys in the chat. This is the first appendix of my book, which is every practice method discussed in the book in PDF form, and it's like super Cliff Notes version of the book that you can print out and keep with you while you're practicing. My publisher made it freely available, so it's also on my website if you lose it, but it's in the chat for you now. One method of practicing I do want to talk about because it's relevant to this conversation around the pathways is the idea of doing something 10 times correctly or some number of times correctly. I'm sure you guys have heard that advice or some variant of that advice before. And on the face of it, it's good advice, right? You want to do something multiple times correctly to make sure you really have it. There's a potential fatal flaw in this advice, though. So you can imagine going into the practice room and being like, okay, I always mess up the rhythm in this measure. I'm going to make sure that I can do it, let's say, 10 times correctly. So you do it once, great. Do it twice, great. Third try, you were a little distracted by something. That one's not good. Okay, doesn't count. Try again, distracted. Doesn't count. You can imagine that by the time you did 10 good ones, you could have done 10 not good ones that didn't count. In which case, you have gone down this pathway 10 times, but you've also gone down this pathway 10 times. So you've done literally and precisely nothing except wasted your time and made yourself really frustrated because you feel like you spent all this practice time and you still can't do it the way you want reliably. So the way to use this advice of X number of times correctly in a way that will actually help you is to add the words in a row. You have to do it a certain number of times correctly in a row. So what in a row means is if you get it wrong after the second try, you have to go back to zero and start over again. When there's a consequence like that for getting it wrong, you focus much more in general, but you focus much more precisely on what exactly you need to do to get it right. And that's the information that your brain actually needs in order to recreate it, especially in a performance situation. So you want to be as precise as you possibly can always when you're practicing with what you're hearing, what's going wrong, but also how do I get this right? If you can do it, why? Be really precise. How did I do that? Okay, I need to recreate exactly that. And those words in a row are very encouraging of practicing in that much more precise way. In terms of how many times in a row to do it, people often do 3. That's not quite enough. There's a longer conversation around what's called overlearning that we're not going to have today. But for practical purposes, doing something at least 5 times in a row seems to be the minimum to make it stick for you. We're going to talk more about doing repetitions like this when we talk about breaks in just a little bit. So I'm going to leave the rest of this conversation for a few minutes until we get to that part. But the takeaway from here is make sure you know how you got it right and make yourself do your repetitions a certain number of times in a row, at least 5 in a row, if you want it to stick. So we've talked about the brain noticing when pathways aren't being used and getting rid of them. The brain also notices when pathways are being used a lot, and it does what I call supercharging them. So with our analogy, this would be like installing a moving sidewalk or something for your friends so they get right to your house for the party. In brain terms, when you supercharge a pathway, what is happening is that long arm of the neuron that sticks out that we talked about where that electrical signal goes down, that long arm, that axon, gets wrapped up in something called myelin, which you may have heard of before. Myelin is just a layer of fat, essentially, that wraps up around that axon and allows the electrical signal to move more quickly and more efficiently down the axon. So when you have a skill that has neuronal pathways that have been myelinated, to you on the outside, that skill feels automatic. So for everybody here, writing your name is automatic. You can write your name while I'm talking to you, and you don't have to think about how to spell your name. You don't have to think about how to make the letters, right? You can just do it without thinking. It's very, very easy because the pathway's been myelinated. But if any of you have small children in your lives who are just learning how to write, you know it's really hard for them to do that. They really have to concentrate on which letter comes next. How do I make the letters properly? Because they're brand new to the skill and it's not myelinated for them yet. But as they write their name more and more, it'll get myelinated and then it will get easier for them. So what we really have to protect against when we're practicing is this, right? Myelinating the wrong pathway. This is bad habits. This is why they feel so hard to break and they feel like you just do them without any thought because they're myelinated pathways. The signal just goes really quickly through the pathway and it happens kind of before you even realize it. So the way that myelin works Once it's on there, it's on there. There's no way to tell the brain to take it off. So it's a bigger undertaking to get rid of a myelinated pathway. In terms of our analogy, this would be like a big highway with like guardrails and lights. You can't just like put some snow on it and think nobody's going to notice. There's a road there, right? You have to have a big construction crew come in. The analogy breaks down because there is no construction crew in the brain. When you have a myelinated pathway, you have to make a brand new pathway that bypasses this dirty socks pathway that's been myelinated. And you have to make sure that you pay conscious attention to your new habit all the time. I tell my students when they're fixing a habit that they need to pay attention to it when they're tuning their instrument, when they're messing around with their friends, when they're in ensemble, like all the time. When you have a new habit and you have to pay conscious attention to it, it feels very annoying because it's something that you're used to having just doing without thought. Even if you know it's not working, it feels easy because it is. It's myelinated. Making a new pathway is really arduous and really annoying. I've been through the process many times myself with bad habits. But if you pay conscious attention to it and you understand that, okay, this is going to be time consuming and also frustrating, but that's the way because you're creating a new pathway, it'll help you stick with it. It's also going to happen that you're going to fall into your old habit. Just that's the nature of old habits. Every time you catch yourself in the new habit, it will help you go down the right pathway and it will help you further implement that new pathway. So just catch yourself as many times as you can. Try not to beat yourself up when you catch yourself in the old habit. That's very, very easy to do, right? Those of you who have changed habits know that. Every time you catch yourself in the old habit, celebrate that you caught it because the more times you catch it, that's bringing conscious awareness to that old habit and it makes it easier to go away. So catch yourself, celebrate that you caught it, and then do your new habit consciously. It is annoying, it is time consuming, but it's totally possible. So, the takeaway from this part of the conversation today is to always ask yourself the question when you're practicing, which pathway am I reinforcing by how I'm practicing right now? I'll say that again. Which pathway am I reinforcing by how I'm practicing right now? I think that question goes a long way towards protecting against this for sure, bad habits. I find that when something is not working, despite the fact that you've practiced it a lot, most of the time, it's because people have been reinforcing a pathway that is adjacent to what you want to reinforce, but not actually what you want to reinforce. If you take a step back and really ask that question, you'll find, oh my gosh, I thought I was reinforcing this, but I was actually reinforcing something right next door, which isn't actually what I want. And then you can kind of back up and think about, okay, how do I reinforce what I actually want to have happen? Okay, so that is the first sort of big portion of our presentation today is to talk about these pathways because it's a fundamental aspect of how the brain works. Now I have some questions for you. You can put your answers in the chat. So I have 4 questions and then I'll give you the answers. First question, true or false? It's best to set aside a large block of time, an hour or more, to practice each day. So you can put in the chat true, false, or I'm not sure. That is also fair. If you're not sure, you are welcome to say that as well. Okay, lots of falses. I'll give you the answers in just a moment. Okay, next question. True or false? It's best to pick one thing to focus on and work on that until you've mastered it before moving on to something else. So true, false, or I'm not sure. That is also always acceptable. So you can put your answers in here. Okay, this one's a little bit more mixed, it looks like. Okay. Next question. Which is better, practicing for an hour without a break or taking a break every 5 to 10 minutes? So you can say an hour, you can take breaks, or I'm not sure. Okay, lots of votes for breaks. And final question, which is better, practicing for 10 minutes each day or 60 minutes once a week? So you can put your answers in there, or I'm not sure, that's always acceptable. Okay, you guys agree with each other and you mostly agree with me, which is awesome. If you had different answers than me, that's okay. You get to learn something today. So, first one, true or false? It's best to set aside a large block of time, an hour or more to practice each day. This one is false. Hopefully you'll understand why after the next part of our discussion. The next one is also false. This was the one that people were the least sure on. So it's actually not best to just work on one thing till you've mastered it before moving on. We'll talk about why. It is definitely better to take a break every 5 to 10 minutes. I'm very happy to see all the fans of breaks in the chat. And then definitely better to practice 10 minutes each day than once a week for a big block of time. So you guys did really well on these questions. If you disagreed with my answers, that's okay too. All right. So we're going to talk now about the science of breaks. The way we think we should practice, both in classical music training, but I think in our culture in general, is this, right? There's these big cultural messages like be as busy as you can all the time, do as much as you possibly can all the time, all the time, all the time, cram as much as you possibly can in the day, practice as long as you possibly can, just like as much as possible, like this guy. But what the science says, and I should also say that this science that we're about to talk about, it goes back to the 1880s. This has a very long tradition that has somehow not made it into our public consciousness, certainly as musicians. But this is not new information. This is very old. What science says is that we'll make a lot more progress if we spend some time on the couch with our cat. More specifically, that taking breaks is really important for learning, and actually we make the most progress during breaks, which I know is the most counterintuitive thing ever, but we'll talk about why that is. So I want to start this conversation today by talking about two studies that were done on medical students studying to be surgeons. And they were looking at different ways of training them in terms of the scheduling of their time. So both studies had the same experimental design. They broke the surgical students into two groups, and one group did all of their training all on one day. This was called the MASSED group, MASSED. So they did one training module, each training module like back to back on a Monday, let's say. The other group, known as the spaced group, because their training was more spaced out, they did one training module per week until they'd done all of them. So they would go in, say, every Monday, and they would do a different training module until, again, they'd done all of them. So everybody did the same exact training. Everybody did the same amount of training. It was just how it was split up schedule-wise. So the first study that I want to share with you looked at the number of students, the percentage of students in each group who reached proficiency at the various skills they were working on. You can see how starkly different these numbers are. So again, the massed group is the group that did all their training in one day. The spaced group is the group that did one training module per week. And you can see how different these numbers are. 39% reached proficiency versus 90%, 11% reached proficiency versus 70%. Like, that's a really big difference. This is just one study of many that finds this, that when you take breaks essentially as part of your training, you reach a higher level of skill, and more people in the group that took breaks reach proficiency if that's what's being measured. So that's the first study. The second study had the same experimental design in terms of the groups and the scheduling, but this time they were interested in the transfer of skill. So they gave everybody a pre-test to see how well did they do before any training at all. Then they did their training, and then they had to transfer what they learned in their training to a more real-world situation. And then they measured, okay, how well did they do in this real-world situation? So here's what they found. Let me describe this to you. So the white boxes here are the spaced group. That's the group that had one training module per week. The gray boxes are the massed group that did all their training all in one day. In each pair of graphs, on the left shows their score on a pretest before any training, and then the graph on the right in each pair shows how well they did on this transfer test after they'd done all their training, and then they had to transfer it to a more real-world situation. I want to draw your attention to two specific aspects of this. One is this global ratings up here. That was sort of their overall score in the end. You can see that for the massed group, there is no difference between the pre-test and the transfer test. They did not learn anything that transferred because they didn't do any better on the transfer test as compared to the pre-test. Whereas the group that took breaks, they got a lot better, right? They have a higher global rating on their transfer test. So that's good. That's what we want. The other one I want to point out is the competency score down here. Again, the massed group did not learn anything that they were able to transfer. They have the same score on the pretest and the transfer test, whereas the spaced group obviously has a higher competency score on the transfer test. So this is another thing that you find when you take breaks, is that what you learn in one situation transfers a lot better to a new situation when you've taken breaks as part of your training. I think this is especially relevant to musicians because we spend a lot of time working on technical fundamentals, right? Scales, arpeggios, like whatever. We just spend a lot of time working on that stuff. The reason we do that is because we hope it will transfer to our repertoire. We also hope that whatever we learn in a specific piece of repertoire will transfer to other pieces of repertoire, right? What this research says is that when you take breaks as part of your training, that transfer will take place a lot more successfully. Okay, last study that I want to share on breaks. This one was not done on surgical students. This was done on everyday people learning a specific button press sequence on a computer keyboard. So they practiced this button press sequence for 10 seconds, and then they got a 10-second micro break, and then they practiced for 10 more seconds, 10-second micro break, and so on. What you're looking at on the screen right now is a graph of their progress over the course of the study. The squiggles are those 10-second practice sessions and how well they're doing. The gaps between the squiggles are the 10-second break. If you look at the end of any given squiggle and the beginning of the next squiggle, you can see it's always higher after that 10-second break. Does everybody see that? If you compare any pair of squiggles, actually, it's that way for the entire thing, that people are always better higher up, higher level after the micro break. In fact, when the researchers analyzed the data, they found that the vast majority of the improvement was attributable to the breaks, not the practice sessions themselves. And so this begs the question, why, right? Like breaks are clearly, hopefully they're clearly important from this little bit of conversation that we had about them. But the question is, why? What is going on? Why are breaks so powerful? So one answer comes from this micro break study. They actually had people hooked up to a brain scanner while they were doing this, and they found that during the 10-second micro break, the brain was replaying what they had just practiced 20 times faster. So the brain was doing a super fast forward replay of what they had been practicing, which is just really, really cool. So it's not wasted time. Your brain is doing a lot. So that's the first reason why breaks are really important. The brain continues to process what you were just working on. The other reason it's really important to take breaks is going back to what I said earlier about physical changes being necessary for learning. Remember, I said physical changes have to happen at the synapse. Hold on to this idea because we're going to come back to it later. Now is the later. So in order for you to learn new things, in order for you to improve at things, the brain needs to make physical changes to itself at the synapse, like we talked about, and also bigger changes. Those changes can really only happen when you're taking a break. So I have two analogies to help people wrap their minds around this. The first is road construction. If there's a bunch of potholes in the road and they need to fix it, you can't have people driving on the road while they're trying to fix the road, right? They shut down the road, repave the road, and then when they open it back up, it's a much better driving experience. It's the same thing for our brains. Our brains need us to take a break, come in and do the construction they need to do, and then come back and it feels much better. The second analogy is that of strength training. So anybody that's ever done strength training knows you don't actually get stronger during the workout itself. You create micro tears in your muscles and the body repairs the muscle stronger on your rest days. That's why rest days are so important, right? You don't do leg day 2 days in a row because your muscles need to rest. And it's actually during the rest that you build muscle, that you actually get stronger. Our brains are exactly the same, essentially. You're not creating micro tears in your brain when you're practicing, but you are giving your brain input, just like you give your muscles input. And then during your break, your brain actually does stuff with that input. And when you come back, you're at a higher level. So breaks are really, really, really crucial. If you're not taking regular and lots of breaks, start. So, some practical application of this. The first is within a practice session, take lots of micro breaks. And this is where I'm going to come back to what I was talking about before with repetitions. So the way that I do my repetitions of doing something correctly is I will usually try to play something correctly 3 times in a row, and then I'll take a little micro break of 10 to 15 seconds. I get a sip of water. I always practice in front of a window, so I look out the window and see what's going on out there with my neighbors or any animals or whatever. 10 to 15 seconds, just kind of stand there and space out, and then I try to get 3 more. If I can do all 6 of those correct, then great, I'm going to work on something else and I'll come back to it later. If I get any of those 6 incorrect, I have to go back to 0 and I give myself a double consequence. So now I have to do 3 sets of 3. So 3, micro break, 3, micro break, 3, micro break. The microbreak study came out in 2021, so I've only been doing this microbreaks thing for a handful of years, and I can say it really makes a difference. Stuff sticks with me way better especially over time versus when I didn't used to take micro breaks. So I can attest to how well it works. In addition to this, come back to the same thing multiple times during a practice session. We tend to, this was one of those questions, we tend to stick with one thing till we've mastered it, work on it for a big block of time, then when we got it, okay, now I can move on to other stuff. But you're going to be much better off if you work on something for a while. Maybe let's just say there's 5 steps that you have to put together to be able to play it. So maybe you do step 1, and now you're going to take a break and work on some other stuff or take a break completely from practicing, and then you're going to come back later and maybe you'll do steps 2 and 3 now or something like that. But you want to continually return to things so your brain gets a break. You also want to come back to the same thing several times throughout the day. So I used to practice by doing like a block of Bach in the morning, and then I would do Brahms, and I wouldn't revisit Bach or Brahms until, the next day. Now I revisit things multiple times throughout the day. So today was a weird practice day. I had an hour this morning and I had 2 different pieces I had to work on. So I did half an hour essentially on each one, but mixed up. And then right before this, I practiced for another hour and I did another half hour on each one of those pieces. What I would have done in the past is an hour on piece 1 in the morning, an hour on piece 2 in the afternoon, but much better to do a little bit in the morning, a little bit in the afternoon so that my brain got a break in between. We didn't really talk about this, but the research on this topic of breaks also shows that the better you get at something, you want to take longer and longer breaks. So think days to weeks off. I know that that is really scary, because you feel like, okay, I got it. Now I have to maintain it. You will hold on to it so much better if you take days and weeks off. I did a huge experiment on myself early on in the pandemic to essentially prove this to myself, and I will never, ever, ever go back to how I used to practice, which was trying to do everything every day. It just works so unbelievably better to take days and weeks off from stuff, especially when you get good at it. It's just so, so, so much better. And you can also practice more stuff because you're not trying to maintain everything all the time. And then finally, get enough sleep. Sleep is the ultimate break. We're not really talking about sleep today, but sleep is the ultimate break. Your brain really needs you to sleep in order to continue to process things. We'll talk a little bit more about sleep when we start talking about memorization in just a moment. But sleep is really crucially important as well as part of this conversation about breaks. Okay, time to switch gears now and talk about memorization. So some of these topics. Oh, wait, I have one more slide. I forgot. Not memorization yet. One more. This is about practice organization. So you never want to practice for longer than 30 minutes without at least a 5-minute break. For singers, I feel like you guys know this already because your bodies you can't practice for big, long periods of time. But pianists and string players, we are especially guilty of practicing for huge, long blocks of time, right, without taking a break. So after 25 to 30 minutes, take at least a 5-minute break. After 60 to 90 minutes of practice with breaks 5-minute breaks every 30 minutes, take an hour and a half to a 2-hour break. So I usually practice, I have 2 ways I do it. I usually practice, what I did today was I did an hour this morning. I did 30. I didn't take a 5-minute break. Actually, I exercised. I did 30 and then I did Pilates for half an hour and then I took a shower and then another 30 minutes. What I did this afternoon right before this is I did 20 minutes, 5-minute break, 20 minutes, 5-minute break, 20 minutes. So those are the sort of the different options that I do, but I had 2 hours in between my morning practice time and my afternoon practice time. I have been practicing on this schedule, 5-minute break every 30 minutes. After every hour to hour and a half of practice, a much longer break. I've been using this schedule since I was 15. So I did my entire education with this. I've done my entire professional life with this. It absolutely works. Whenever I have students who switch to this practice schedule, they are astounded at how much better they feel and how much quicker they make progress. Better in terms of their brains, but also physically. This also really helps save your body from unnecessary wear and tear. Okay, now it's time to talk about memorization. So I like to start this conversation by talking about the different types of memory, because we tend to think that memory is one unitary thing, but actually there's a whole bunch of different types of memory that work together so seamlessly that we feel like they're one thing, but we know they're separate based on people with brain damage, actually, that one type of memory can be totally obliterated and other types are completely fine. So, one type of memory is known as declarative or explicit memory, and there's different types of declarative and explicit memory. One of those types is known as semantic memory. So, this is your memory for facts and things like that. This is a picture of William Primrose, who's a very famous violist, playing his viola upside down. So, for me as a violist, I have lots of facts stored about William Primrose in my declarative memory, in my explicit memory. There's also what's known as episodic memory. This is also a type of declarative or explicit memory. Episodic memory is sometimes known as autobiographical memory. So this is your memory for events. So I have a memory of every concert I've ever played. My parents have been at most of the concerts I've played in my life. They also have episodic memories, but theirs are different than mine because we had different experiences of those events. On the opposite side to declarative or explicit memory is something known as procedural or implicit memory. This is what we as musicians know as muscle memory, right? So you can put it into words, but not really. There are other types of memory that are implicit. It's not just muscle memory. So, for instance, our knowledge of the rules of our native language, that largely for most of us relies on implicit memory. If you've ever had someone learning English as a second language ask you, why do you say it this way and not this way? And you're like, I don't know. You just say it like that. Like, I don't really know. We tend not to have good access to the rules of our native language. We just know it just doesn't sound right if you say it that way, but you don't know why. It's because it's implicit knowledge. So when we make music, when we play or sing from memory, we're using all three of these different types potentially. These different types also break down further into smaller subtypes. So one of those subtypes is long-term memory, which I'm sure you've heard of. This is memory for things that you learned or experienced a long time ago. Long-term memory has essentially unlimited capacity. It's very stable, doesn't break down very well under pressure. Long-term memory is what you want to be using when you're performing from memory, as we'll talk more about. The opposite of long-term memory, which I'm sure you've also heard of, is short-term memory. So short-term memory is I tell you my phone number, you don't have any way to write it down, and you repeat it over and over in your head until you can write it down. Unlike long-term memory, short-term memory has a very limited capacity. It breaks down really easily, especially under pressure. So for instance, if I told you my phone number, you had no way to write it down and you were repeating it to yourself, and then suddenly you got a really important phone call. You had to take that phone call. When you got off the phone, you would not remember my phone number anymore, right? Because your ability to repeat it over and over in your head had been disrupted. Comparable, sort of, to short-term memory, but slightly different, is something called working memory. So working memory is like short-term memory in that you're holding it in mind, like my phone number, but you are using it and working with the information in some way. So if I told you my phone number and you had to repeat it in your mind to hold on to it, and I told you to add up the individual digits of my phone number and tell me what that came to, that would be using working memory. And you can imagine how hard that would be, right? To remember my phone number and add up the numbers at the same time. So working memory, like short-term memory, has a limited capacity. It also breaks down under pressure. We don't want to be using it when we are performing. To make sure that you really know the difference between working memory and long-term memory and how it feels to use your working memory, we are going to do a working memory task that they use in the lab to test people's working memory. This is known as the N-back task. So the way it's going to work is you're going to see a series of pictures. They're cute little animals. Your job is to say if the picture you're currently looking at is the same as two pictures ago. So, as an example, if I showed you this cute little penguin, and then he disappeared, but for right now he'll stay up. If the penguin disappeared and then you saw this cute little bee, and then you saw the penguin again, the answer would be yes. The second penguin is the same as two ago. Everybody understand what's happening? So this is automated. So once I press the button, it's just going to go. So for the first two, you obviously can't say anything because there aren't two ago. But once we get to the third one, just say to yourself, yes or no, same picture as two ago. Everyone ready to go? Okay, here we go. Okay, here are the answers. All the ones with check marks on them were the yeses. So there's five yeses. If you got five, you got a perfect score. If you didn't, that's okay. But you should, when I do this in person with everybody in person and people answer out loud, for the first B, everyone's like, yes. And then as we go through, people get less and less confident. You may have experienced that yourself. So you can see that that was relatively challenging, right? If I had put you under pressure, and I said, if you get even a single one wrong, you're going to be fined $1,000. You would have done a lot worse because you would have second guessed yourself, right? All over the place. Incidentally, this is known as the N back task because N stands in for a number. We did a 2 back task. In the lab, they do up to 7 back. Can you imagine having to remember 7 back and they just keep coming? I would totally fail at that. Oh my God. But anyway, you can see why you don't want to use working memory when you're performing from memory. Working memory also divides into subcategories. So there is visual spatial working memory and verbal working memory. These can be very different abilities within an individual. So to use myself as an example, I have an excellent verbal working memory. I'm in the 98th percentile, something like that. And I have a terrible visual spatial working memory. I'm in the 50 something percentile, which means there's people worse than me, which is like horrifying because I can feel how bad my visual spatial working memory is. It has nothing to do with intelligence. It's just brains work differently. Everybody's brain is different, right? And they can just be, yeah, really, really different within a person. Verbal working memory and musical working memory are also separate things. I actually have a really bad musical working memory, which is hilarious because I'm a professional musician. But I only mention this because we're always using our working memory. We're always using it in some capacity, and knowing which one is your strong suit, which one is your weak suit, can help you sort of tailor how you might go about doing things. If you want to know for yourself, you can Google like verbal working memory test, and you can find tests online to take to see for you. Most people kind of have a sense of which one works better for them. But anyways, from this conversation, hopefully you can see that you don't want to be using your working memory when you're performing from memory. You want to be using your long-term memory. So most of our conversation today is going to be centered around how do you get better at training your long-term memory? How are long-term memories made, essentially? So there are 3 steps to making long-term memories. I'm going to tell you the 3 steps, and then we're going to go look at each one of them in depth for how you can get better at them with learning your music. So step 1 of making long-term memories is known as encoding. How do you get the information into your brain in the first place? We know that something called deep encoding leads to better memory for information. So to illustrate what I mean by this, I'm going to use an example from a very famous study looking at encoding. So in the study, they had college students come into the lab and they sat in front of a computer and individual words would appear on the screen. Half of the students had to supply a definition for each word. The other half of the students had to say what the last letter was. So if they saw house, they just had to say E. So they went through all these words, either supply a definition or tell us the last letter. And then after they were done with the whole list of words, they were asked to write down as many as they could remember. They didn't know they were going to have to do this. It was just a pop quiz at the end. And so everybody wrote down as many as they can remember. Probably you can guess that the people who had to supply a definition remembered more words, which is exactly what they found. That's because they had to actually read the word, right? The other group didn't even have to read the word. They had to actually read the word, but they had to engage with it on a deeper level. They had to connect it to information that they already had stored in their brain. They had to say something about the meaning of the word. That's an example of deep encoding, that you're engaging with the information on a richer level, and that leads to better memory for the information. So this is step 1, encoding. We'll come back and talk about, okay, how do you get better at this as a musician? Step 2 is known as consolidation. So how does the information get from short-term storage to long-term storage? Anytime you learn something new, it goes to short-term storage first, and at some point it has to get transferred to long-term storage. And we know that sleep is really critical for this. So like I said, we're going to talk a bit about sleep in this part of the presentation because it's really important for consolidation. And then step 3 is known as retrieval. How do you get the information back out again when you need it? This is going to sound silly, but we know that the more you practice retrieval, the better you get at retrieving. Sounds silly, but we tend not to practice retrieval enough. So to give an example of studying, like for a test or something like that, the way people typically study is they'll read their textbook and they highlight the important parts. And then when it's time for the test, they go through and read their highlights. That is not practicing retrieval. That is practicing reading text with a colored overlay. That is not what you're going to have to do in the exam, right? So the best way to study for the exam is to take an exam. Write out your own exam as hard as you can imagine it being, then put away your books, put away your notes, and take your own exam because that's going to actually practice retrieval. That you have to come up with the information from your own brain without sort of reading it on something else. And the more you practice retrieval, the better you get at it and the smoother the process goes. So when we're trying to do anything from memory, we need to make sure that these three steps of the process, encoding, consolidation, retrieval, that all three are taken care of. If you only do two, let's say you encoded really well and you got enough sleep so the consolidation piece is taken care of, but you haven't practiced retrieval enough, it can look like you don't remember it, even though it's in there and it's in long-term storage. You just haven't practiced retrieval enough. So all three of these steps are really important. So let's talk about them individually now. So to get better at encoding, one thing that we know leads to deeper and better encoding is something known as chunking. So you may have heard of this before. This is something that lots of people talk about, but essentially when you chunk information, you take separate pieces of information and you put it together in a larger chunk. This helps because one, now instead of a whole bunch of separate pieces of information, you just have a few big chunks. It's less stuff to remember, but also in order to chunk it, you have to think about, okay, how do these different pieces of information relate to each other? How can I put them into some kind of unified chunk? And that results in deeper encoding, right? Because you had to think about the information on a deeper level in order to chunk it in the first place. So we're going to do a short chunking experiment now. You need something to write on for this. So a piece of paper, your phone, whatever, but get something that you can write on. I'll give people a second to find something. It doesn't have to be big. It can be a little post-it note or something like that if you want. So what's going to happen is I'm going to show you a series of letters on the screen. While they're on the screen, I want you to try to commit them to memory. And then once they disappear, then you can write them down. Um, so everybody understand what's going to happen? Series of letters. Try to remember them when they're on there. When they disappear, write them down. They're not on there for very long. Just to warn you, people are always like, ah. So everybody, there's two sets of letters. When the first set disappears, something comes on the screen that says ready for the second set or something, but I'll wait until everybody's ready to go. Okay, here we go. First set of letters. Okay, write down as many as you can remember. And if you couldn't, that's okay too. All right, everybody ready for the second set? Okay, same thing. Try to commit them to memory while they're on the screen. All right, here comes the second set. Okay, write those down. Okay, my guess is you did better on the second set. Here's what you saw. The reason I think you did better on the second set is usually easily chunked. CIA, USA, FBI. It's three acronyms, right? So instead of 9 letters, now you only have 3 things to remember. And also, you know what these letters stand for. You have information about each of these entities stored in your long-term memory, so you're connecting it to something you already know. That helps you remember. It's deeper encoding. Incidentally, the first set of letters is the second set backwards, CIA, USA, FBI. So not only is it the exact same length of list, it's actually the exact same letters, but the first set is usually harder for people. If the first set was easier for you, sometimes people say, oh, I made it into a word, or I did a presentation once for the Brazilian Viola Society, and this was some acronym or some word in Brazilian Portuguese. I don't remember, but everyone agreed, oh, the first one was way easier because of XYZ. It doesn't matter whichever one is easier for you to chunk is the one that you're going to remember more easily. Um, so this sort of illustrates the power of chunking. This conversation about chunking, this is the point of practicing technique. It's also the point of oral skills, music history, music theory class, whatever. Because all of these practices, all of these ways of acquiring knowledge about music, they help you increase your chunks. So when you practice your scales and arpeggios and technical studies, you are learning the chunks and the building blocks of music. Those of you who are pianists here, the first time you learned your first scale, C major scale, right? Probably for all of you. You probably didn't have to remember which notes to play because it's just C to C, white keys, all white keys. But you did have to remember the fingering, right? And you had to remember, okay, when do I cross over? And that was something you really had to remember. And up and down, I don't remember the fingering for C major, but maybe up and down is different. I don't know. For me, as a string player, I had my first scale was A major. And I had to remember where my fingers went, right? And when that's brand new, you have no chunks. And so it's really hard. But for those of you now who have been playing for many years, playing a C major scale, no big deal, right? Because it's all one chunk. You don't have to think about anything having to do with it. When you take music theory class and you learn about common chord progressions, let's say, and you learn that, say, 1-2-5-1 is a very common progression. If you're playing something that's a bunch of arpeggiated chords and you realize, oh, this is just a 1-2-5-1 progression, it makes it a lot easier to remember it because you don't have to remember all those individual notes. You can chunk it as a chord progression. In music history class, we tend to learn about common forms, right? Sonata form for the first movement of a piano sonata, let's say. Um, if you know what the common forms are and you realize, oh, wait, this is the recapitulation, that's why it's the same as the exposition, right? That will help you chunk it because you can put it under a larger umbrella. Brains really don't like information that feels like it exists in a vacuum. Brains really like information that exists under some larger umbrella, exists in some sort of structure that makes sense to you. So when you are practicing and learning your music, you want to make sure that you understand it in this big picture way, that everything has a deeper connection to itself and other things you already know beyond just, well, the composer wrote these notes, so I have to do it. Put it under a larger umbrella and you'll remember it better. Okay, so let me share this graphic with you. This is a big, busy graphic from a meta-analysis that looked at a whole bunch of different studies that were concerned with the development of expertise in memorizing a whole bunch of different types of tasks. And what they did is they took all these different studies and they analyzed them together to figure out, okay, what are the commonalities in how the brain is working when people gain expertise in these different memory areas. So at the top here, they've given us two examples of things people are learning. So remember dots on a matrix or remember these letters. I'm so bad at this dots on a matrix thing. That's because my working memory for visual spatial things is so bad. I'm so bad at this. But anyways, when you're brand new, you have no chunks. And what you find in the brain is that there's a lot of activity in working memory areas. This is a graph here, a bar graph, whereas there's hardly any activity at all in long-term memory areas. This is also a graph. As you start to practice and you get better, you start to create chunks. So they've created some chunks for us up here on this dots on a matrix, and they've created some letter chunks. Once you have some chunks, what you find in the brain is a decrease in activity in working memory areas and an increase in activity in long-term memory areas, which is, again, just what we want. As you continue to practice, you create what I call super chunks. They're actually called knowledge structures, but I like super chunks, so I'm sticking with my terminology. You take your little chunks and you make them into big super chunks. When you have super chunks, what you find in the brain is decreased activity, again, in working memory areas and increased activity in long-term memory areas. Exactly what we want, right? And so this is why great soloists like Yo-Yo Ma or someone like that can play these major giant concertos from memory, no problem whatsoever, because they have these big super chunks, right, for the concerto. Dvorak cello concerto for Yo-Yo Ma is probably one big super chunk for each movement, right? When somebody just learns one of these big repertoire pieces for the first time, they have a bunch of little chunks, but not big super chunks, which is why it's harder for them. So the more you can build out your chunks, make them into big super chunks, the easier time you're going to have. Okay, let me introduce you now to this guy, Roger Chaffin, from my home state of Connecticut. He was a research psychologist at the University of Connecticut for many years. He's retired now, but he worked with musicians directly to look at how do people prepare for memorized performance. Specifically, what he'd do is he would have all of his musicians video record every single practice session on a piece of music that they were preparing to perform from memory, from the very first practice session all the way through the performance. And he would have them keep a practice journal about like what they were doing and why. So he'd get all this data, all these videos, all these practice journals, and then he would sort of analyze them to figure out, okay, what did people do to prepare for memorized performance? What are the commonalities between different musicians? And based on his work, he came up with four different, what he calls performance cue types, information that the musicians are using to chunk the actual notes and rhythms on the page. So his first performance cue type he calls structural cues. So this is understanding the formal structure of the piece. Really make sure when you're learning something, especially if you're going to memorize it, that you understand the formal structure and where you are at all times. So big picture formal structure, and also like within the larger sections, where does each phrase start and end, for instance. But make sure you understand that formal structure. Second is expressive cues. So this is what you're trying to express to the audience. What are you trying to make them feel? What are you trying to achieve expressively? Third, he called interpretive cues. These are things that the composer puts in. So changes in tempo, changes in dynamic, but things supplied by the composer that help you interpret what's on the page. And then what he calls basic cues. So matters of technique, fingerings, bowings, pedaling, what have you. So these are his performance cue types. The other thing he did in his research is 18 months to 2 years after he'd worked with a specific musician, he would get in touch with them out of the blue and be like, remember that piece you learned from me 2 years ago? Go get out a piece of staff paper and write out as much as you can from memory right now. Can you imagine? You get a random phone call from this guy and he asks you to write out something from memory that you haven't thought of in 2 years. So anyway, he had them write it out from memory and then send it to him. And then he would analyze what could they still remember 2 years later, and how did it map on to these performance cues that they used to chunk it in the first place. And what he found were the most durable cues were structural and expressive cues. This I don't think is surprising because these are the ones that require the deepest encoding, right? In order to use structural cues, you have to understand the structure. You have to analyze your music. You have to really look at it to understand how is it put together. And so that it leads to deeper encoding. Same thing for expressive cues, right? In order to figure out what you want to be expressing emotionally or whatever, you got to think about it. And you have to engage with the music on a deeper level than just, oh, well, the composer read this, so I might as well play it. Interpretive cues and basic cues weren't as durable because these are things that are shallower, right? Interpretive cues are supplied by the composer. You don't have to do work to sort of make sense of it. So again, the more you can engage with your music on a deep level, a rich level, understand it from these different perspectives, the easier time you'll have memorizing it. Often musicians will feel like, there's a particular passage where you just don't know what to do with it. You're just like, okay, well, I'm playing what's on the page, I'm doing the dynamics, but you feel like you don't understand it. You're not going to be able to remember it very well if you can't understand it. You don't have to understand what the composer meant. You can make up something that would make them roll over in their grave. As long as it has meaning to you, that will help you remember it. And that's the most important thing from the standpoint of your brain holding on to it, is that you create meaning that resonates with you. Okay, let's move on now to consolidation. That's our second step. This is how the information gets from short-term storage to long-term storage. And I said that sleep is really important. I'm going to do a quick commercial for a book, Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. Matthew Walker is one of the leading neuroscientists in the study of sleep. This book came out, I want to say like 2015, 2016, something like that. Like, I feel like within the last 10 years, relatively recently. Anyway, it's fantastic. It's super interesting. You'll learn so much stuff about sleep. It will change the way you think about sleep for forever. It's also on Audible if you're an audiobook person. So it's really fantastic. He also has a podcast. So if you're interested in that too, he has a great podcast about sleep. So when we learn something new, the information goes to a part of the brain called the hippocampus. We actually have two, one on each side. As you can see, it's like right above the ear, kind of in the middle of the brain. And the hippocampus is a temporary memory storage facility. So new stuff goes into your hippocampus. And then while you're sleeping, the brain transfers the information from the hippocampus out to the cerebral cortex, the bumpy outer part of the brain. Some of the information gets transferred during REM sleep. Some of it gets transferred during non-REM sleep. The brain treats different types of information, implicit memory, muscle memory versus declarative memory, like we talked about. The brain treats these different memory types differently in terms of when this transfer takes place. So if you don't get enough sleep, you're going to shortchange yourself on REM and or non-REM sleep, which means that this transfer either takes place incompletely or potentially doesn't take place at all if you get too little sleep. And then what it is like is essentially like when you have a corrupted file or something in your computer, like it's there and you double click and it just won't open. So that's essentially what happens when you don't get enough sleep because this transfer really isn't taking place very well. So make sure you get enough sleep so your brain can do this transfer. We know from research actually that was done by Matthew Walker in the early 2000s that when you have a full night of sleep, you get a boost in your ability to do whatever it is the next day. So, in a nutshell, what he did in these studies is he had people learn something on day one, learn how to do something. This was a motor skill. On day one, practice it a certain number of times, sent them home to go to sleep, and then brought them back the next day to see how they were doing. And what he found was that on day two, people were way faster and way more accurate. So in this graph right here, the black bars are showing their progress on day one. The gray bars are showing how well they were doing on day two. The top graph is showing speed. The bottom graph is showing number of mistakes. And you can see on day one, it's essentially a linear progression. And then suddenly on day two, there's this huge jump, right? And they're much faster and they're much more accurate. So then he took another group of people and he had them practice essentially half as much on the first day and found exactly the same big jump. And then he had one more group of people do minimal practice on the first day, but still found the same big jump on day two. And this is a very well-known finding at this point that if you learn something on day one and then you get a full night of sleep, you'll get a really big boost in your ability to do that skill the next day because of what the brain does while you're sleeping. These series of studies wasn't specifically looking at memory, however, so I wanted to share a study with you that was done on pianists actually, looking specifically at this and specifically at memorizing music and the role of sleep. So in this particular study, the pianists had to learn melody A and or melody B. You can see them here. They split the pianists into four different groups. So group A had to learn melody A, try to memorize it, then they went home, went to sleep, and then the next day they were tested on their ability to play melody A from memory. Group 2 was trained on melody A, they had to memorize it, then they learned melody B, tried to memorize it, go home, go to sleep, then they came back the next day and they had to play melody A from memory as best they could. Group 3 learned melody A, tried to memorize it, learned melody B, tried to memorize it. Then they got a little refresher on A. Then they went home, went to sleep, came back next day, tested on melody A. Group 4 learned melody A, tried to memorize it, went home, went to sleep, came back the next day, learned melody B, tried to memorize it, and then they were tested on melody A. Everybody understand what the four different groups had to do? So the question was, how well would they do? What was the role of sleep? And also, did A and B interact with each other in any way? So here's what they found. So this group up here, this is the group that learned melody A, then they went to sleep, then they were tested on A, and you can see that this is where they were at the end of day one. This data point up here is the next day. You can see they get this boost from sleep, just like in Matthew Walker's study. So great, cool. These two groups here, where it's straight across, this group here is they learned A, they went to sleep, then they learned B, tested on A. This group is learned A, learned B, sleep, then tested on A. The straight across line means they didn't get a boost. They didn't get worse, right? But they didn't get that boost from sleep. So melody B kind of blocked their boost in a way. The most interesting group to me is this last one down here. So this is the group that learned A, learned B, then they had a refresher on A, went to sleep, and then they were tested on A. This is how well they were doing on the refresher. And then this data point here is how well they did on the test the next day. So they did get a boost, right? They're a little bit better the next day because they had that refresher. So what does this mean in practical terms? Because, there we go. These melodies are not very long. These are very short and they're not very hard, right? When you are learning music, you're learning way more than just this and it's harder than this. So my takeaway from this is to use this in a very specific way, which is to use it strategically for those parts that you just cannot remember for the life of you. Do it last in the day and then first thing the next morning. It doesn't have to be the literal last thing you do in the day. You don't have to like practice and then jump straight into bed and go to sleep. And then the next morning, the second you wake up, you're at your keyboard playing. It just has to be the last thing you practice and the first thing you practice with no other music in between. So yeah, I use this strategically for those parts that just like, oh man, like it just doesn't stick for some reason. Do it last of the day, first thing the next morning. It will give you a memory boost. Okay, so that's what I want to say about memory, about sleep, about consolidation. So now let's talk about retrieval, which is the last step of the process. Um, so I said earlier that you get better at retrieval when you practice retrieval, but we tend not to do this enough. As musicians, we tend not to practice playing or singing from memory enough because we're scared, right? We're scared we're going to mess up. But the musicians that Roger Chaffin worked with, that research psychologist, they all stressed the importance of being able to go through your mental map of the piece and retrieve the information and be able to sort of retrieve your mental map really, really automatically. This is the music from a cellist that he worked with each of their performance cues marked. There's a key here so you can see what they stand for. Doesn't really matter. Except you can see that this cellist has something approximately every 2 bars that's some sort of information like on their mental map. And all the musicians he worked with really talked about the importance of retrieving this mental map and the retrieval process being totally automatic. Because if you're struggling to retrieve things, it's going to be really hard to perform from memory and feel good about it, right? So I memorize incredibly easily. Stuff just gets memorized for me by the end of day one on practicing something. I have it memorized. That being said, if I'm going to perform a piece from memory, I want to be practicing completely without the music. I want to be completely memorized at least 6 weeks before the performance if I have, that much lead time. Because I need to practice playing from memory. I need to make it super automatic to do this retrieval process. So especially if memorization is hard for you, give yourself plenty of time before the performance that you're practicing retrieval, that you're practicing doing it from memory. I can't tell you the number of times I have seen colleagues when I was in music school or my own students, use the music in studio class one week and think they're going to do it on their recital the next week without music. No, you're not. That's not enough time. You need more time to practice retrieval. Also, with practicing retrieval, is you want to, sorry, advance that too quickly. When we perform from memory, we're essentially using 3 types of memory simultaneously to help us retrieve the information. So one is muscle memory. What does it feel like to play this piece? Second is auditory memory. What does this piece sound like? The WM and LTM there means working memory and long-term memory. Like I said, you're always using your working memory, but you want to be relying on your long-term memory of what does this piece sound like? And then declarative memory. What are the actual notes and rhythms and text for singers for this piece? When I was in grad school at NEC, my teacher, Carol Rodland, who's now at Juilliard, she talked to us all the time about these 3 types of memory. And she would talk all the time about the 3 streams of memory that have to be going and have to be equally strong. She doesn't have a background in neuroscience, but she's 100% right about this. All of us have one of these that's our strong suit. For me, it's absolutely my muscle memory. For many musicians, it's their aural memory that they'll remember how it goes, but they have a hard time remembering physically how to do it. Um, but whatever is our strong suit, we tend to rely just on that one. And if that breaks down in performance, that's not good because then you don't really have anything else, right? But if you strengthen all 3 equally and one breaks down, you still have 2. If 2 break down, you still have 1. It's very unusual that all 3 are going to break down at once and they reinforce each other. So it's important to practice these separately from one another. So to test your muscle memory retrieval, play without sound. So for keyboardists, don't press the keys down, or if you have an electric keyboard, don't turn it on. And see, can you play this from memory without sound? That will test your muscle memory. For singers, that would be doing it in your mind, right? So can you sing it through in your head? I don't know if there's any bowed string players here, but something that is really great for string players, and I'll talk about how non-string players can do it in a sec, is to take your instrument and detune the strings so you don't have whatever your strings are supposed to be, A, D, G, C for violists and cellists, but you have completely random strings. And then you want to try to play your piece from memory, not to make it sound right, but to make it feel right. So you have totally absurd noises coming out of your instrument, but you're not distracted by those. I should also say, if there's any other bowed string players here, the best way to play without sound on a bowed string is not to air play. It's actually to fold up your cleaning cloth and slip it between the strings and the fingerboard so you can actually play the instrument. It mutes the strings and you just get a bunch of squeaks, but it feels much more like real playing that way. So anyway, you want to test your muscle memory. For those of you that aren't bowed string players, a way to do this second one that's sort of equivalent is to put on headphones with music playing that's different from what you're playing on your instrument. So turn on some random piece of music and then see if you can play your piece without being able to hear what you're doing when there's other music going on in your ears. That's really, really hard. If you're not sure you're playing it right, record it and then you can listen back and see if you did it right because you won't be able to hear it in real time. To test your auditory memory, practice singing it from memory. Don't look at your music, don't have your instrument so you can silently finger along. Can you sing it from memory? You can do it on la la la. You can do it for singers, do it on the text. For instrumentalists, you could do it on solfege, you could do it on note names, you can do it on finger numbers. Kind of doesn't matter, but you want to practice singing it from memory. It's also important to join your muscle and your auditory memory. I have a little bit more to say about this on the next slide. But it's also very helpful to help join the two together to practice singing out loud while fingering along for those of you that play instruments with your weak suit going first. So if your muscle memory is the weak one, put the finger down first, then sing it. Then put the next finger down, then sing it. If your auditory memory is the weak one, sing it first, then put the finger down, then sing the next one, then put the finger down. So the weak one goes first, and that will join the two together. And then finally, declarative memory. So draw a formal diagram of your piece from memory. Can you draw what the structure is? Big structure, small structure. You can do this the way they teach you in music theory class, or you can just do it whatever way you want. It doesn't matter, but draw out the structure of the piece. Do you know that from memory? And then do what Roger Chaffin had his musicians do, write it out from memory. Get a blank piece of staff paper, try to write it out from memory. This is really hard to do, and write out everything you can remember from the score. Notes, rhythms, slurs, articulations, pedaling, dynamics, like everything on the page, write it out from memory as best you can. Okay, so I said that it's important to join muscle memory and auditory memory. I want to talk about this auditory motor connection now. We know from research on professional and amateur violinists that when professional violinists, but not amateurs, finger silently, not only is the motor cortex in the brain activated, but the auditory cortex is activated, this part of the brain right here. The auditory cortex is only supposed to be activated when you hear stuff, but these people were playing silently, and yet the auditory cortex was activated. We also know that when pianists are played a recording of something they know how to play well, not only is the auditory cortex active as it should be, but even if they're sitting there not playing, not moving, the motor cortex is active. Again, the motor cortex is only supposed to be active when you're moving, but these people are not moving. And in fact, the way the motor cortex was activated was very specific to how you play the piece. So this brain here is, this colored strip is the motor cortex. And the blow up over here is showing that there are different parts of the brain devoted to different body parts. So it's not just an undifferentiated strip of brain. There's a very specific part that controls your thumb. There's a very specific part that controls your index finger, etc. In this study with the pianists, they found that when someone would play a given note with their thumb, the thumb area was active. When they would play a given note with their pinky, the pinky area was active. So it was very specific activation to how you would play it. Based on this research, so auditory cortex activation when fingering silently, motor cortex activation when listening and not moving, I have a pet theory that is not 100% backed up by science, but enough that I feel confident in saying it. And my pet theory is this. I was Suzuki trained as a kid. I was trained by ear. I and many, many, many teachers have noticed that Suzuki trained kids and other students who were trained by ear from the beginning, jazz, bluegrass, any tradition that has you learning by ear, that those students memorize very easily, just like I do. Whereas students who are trained reading music from the start, that their first experience with the instrument is reading music, those students typically have a much harder time memorizing. So, my pet theory is that this auditory motor connection starts forming very early on in people who learn by ear from the beginning. And then when you take the music away, that is still intact. But when you learn with music from the beginning, the connection that gets fostered is between the motor cortex and the visual cortex. You take the music away, you've taken the visual away, and you're left just with implicit memory. And so it feels like, I don't know this. So there's research training people. A lab has developed an fMRI sort of cello. It's not really a cello, but it's close enough to a cello. They've trained people to play this cello by ear, and you do find this auditory motor co-activation already happening after just a handful of weeks of lessons in these people who are trained by ear playing this fMRI compatible cello. And so that shows that part of the theory that this auditory motor coactivation starts developing very, very early. What hasn't been done is taking people who learn with music from the ear to see, or learn with music from the beginning, to see if there's this connection between the motor cortex and the visual cortex. I've wanted someone to do this for years. I want to do it, but someone has to give me an fMRI machine. Anyways, based on this pet theory, when I have students who have difficulty memorizing, I tell them that they need to start doing two things every day. One, learn something by ear every single day. Start with kids' songs, Christmas songs, folk songs, like simple songs. Learn something by ear every single day. Once the folk songs get easy, the next best thing is often like movie soundtracks or like commercial jingles, something like that that's like easy to hold in mind, but it's a little more complicated than a folk song. And then finally, like actual music. But when you learn something by ear every day, it will start to foster this auditory motor connection. The other thing you want to do is to play something by memory every day. Something. It doesn't have to be a lot, just something. When I have students do this and they actually do it and they learn something by ear and they play something from memory every single day, their ability to memorize gets markedly better after about a month or two of doing this. And I really think it's because this auditory motor coactivation is being developed and is happening. So like I said, I don't totally have the science to back it up, but enough that I'm confident and I've seen that it works really well. Okay, so all of this begs the question, when should we start playing from memory? When should we start testing our retrieval? I'm going to share a study with you that was done on singers, actually. These singers had 6 15-minute practice sessions to learn a new piece of music, a new song. And in the final practice session, they had to sing as much as they could from memory. They were allowed to practice however they wanted. After the study was over and everyone had practiced and then had to sing from memory in the final session, Jane Ginsburg, the researcher in this case, looked at the singers and saw that they kind of divided into two groups, fast, accurate memorizers and slow, inaccurate memorizers. And so then she looked at, okay, how did these two groups practice differently? There's a lot of really interesting data that came out of this study, but a couple of things that I want to share with you. So on the left is, this should be, it says bars attempted from memory. It should actually be beats attempted from memory. There weren't 500 bars in this song. That would be a long song. So anyway, beats attempted from memory. And then over here, this is showing word errors from memory. So you can see, and the white bars, slow and accurate memorizers, black bars, fast, accurate memorizers. You can see that the fast, accurate memorizers are attempting something in the first practice session, and they're attempting a lot in the second practice session, whereas the slow, inaccurate memorizers aren't really attempting anything at all. And you might say, okay, well, they're fast, accurate memorizers. Of course they can attempt stuff because they're fast and accurate, like obviously. But if you look over here at word errors from memory, you can see that the fast, accurate memorizers aren't so accurate, right? They're making a lot of mistakes, especially in that second practice session. In the first one they are, but certainly in that second practice session, they are making a ton of mistakes. But they are giving themselves the opportunity to test their memory, make the mistakes, learn from the mistakes, and that makes their memory better. And then you can see in the final practice session, they're hardly making any mistakes at all, whereas the slow, inaccurate memorizers are making a ton of mistakes because they waited too long to start testing their memory. They didn't give themselves the opportunity to learn from their mistakes and correct their mistakes. One thing that is often confusing to people over here where it says the final practice session, it looks like the fast, accurate memorizers did half as much, right, as the slow, inaccurate memorizers. But actually what this is the fast, accurate memorizers came in, sang the whole song, made a minimum number of mistakes, and then left. The slow, inaccurate memorizers came in, made a bazillion mistakes, had to keep going over the music and doing it again. And so in the end, they essentially sang the thing twice through because they kept making mistakes and having to back up. So they sang more beats of music because a lot of those were errors. So what this study suggests is that when you know you're going to have to play something or sing something from memory, you want to start testing your memory early in the process. I think people are reluctant to do that because they think, oh, I'm going to make mistakes. Going back to our conversation about the pathways, what if I reinforce the wrong pathway? Mistakes are necessary for learning. You're going to make mistakes. You're not a robot. You're a human being. The brain really needs mistakes to learn. You only are in danger of reinforcing the wrong pathway if you keep doing the same mistake over and over and over again. If you sing the wrong words and you don't realize you've made a mistake and you keep singing the wrong words, then yes, you have the wrong pathway that goes to the dirty socks. But if you test yourself on a particular phrase and you sing it once and say record it and listen back and see, okay, that's not the right word there and that is not the right note there, then you can update your memory, right? And then you can try it again with your updated memory and do it right. Doing it wrong once is not a problem. That's one pathway made of footprints through the snow. Nobody's going to think that's the path that you're supposed to take, right? And then it snows again and it gets covered pretty easily. So not only is it okay to make mistakes to test your memory, it's good. When they do research on, for instance, giving people test questions that they have to answer, if people guess, even if they say, I don't know, this is a wild guess, if they guess the answer versus just not giving any answer at all, they remember the correct answer later when they're given it if they guess. So testing your memory and learning from your mistakes is really, really important. Another great way to test retrieval is something known as interleaved or random practice. I have a whole hour-long presentation on this, so this is the very, very, very short condensed version. Basically, when you have the opposite, I should say, of interleaved practice is blocked practice. So doing one big block of something rather than mixing it up and interleaving different things with each other. So I'm going to share one study with you that was done on interleaved practice, but there's probably tens of thousands of studies at this point that have been done on interleaved or random practice. Those words are synonyms. So in this study, they took baseball players. They wanted to increase their ability to hit balls, and so they split them into two groups. One group was the blocked practice group. They got blocks of 15 pitches, 15 fastballs, 15 curveballs, 15 changeup pitches, and they had to hit as many as possible. The other group was the interleaved or random group. They also got 45 total pitches, but they never knew what was coming at them. It was a completely random order. What they found when they brought the baseball players back 2 days later to test their performance is that the blocked practice group had made a 25% improvement, but the random practice group had made a 57% improvement and was now doing a lot better than the blocked practice group. So this is a graph of this study. Where it says acquisition down here, that's the practice session, and you can see that the blocked practice group is on top. They're doing better than the random practice group, which makes sense, right? So they had an easier time. They knew what was coming at them. Where it says transfer test down here, that's the performance. And you can see now they switch, right? Now the random practice group is on top and is doing better. So this is just one study of many, 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 many that finds that random practice, interleaved practice is far better, especially for performing well. And this joins up with what we were talking about with breaks, right? If you practice something for a little bit right now, and then you go practice other stuff, and then you come back to that first thing, you're interleaving your practice rather than doing it in one big block. It will aid your learning because of the breaks, but it will also aid your performance. So how can you use this to test retrieval? So you want to make a list of your hard spots. And this is something to do once you think you have it memorized and you want to test. do I know this? So make a list of your hard spots. I have some examples here. And then you are going to play or sing your first spot as if it's a concert, no stopping, no matter what. If it's good, everything is correct, no hesitations whatsoever, nice and smooth, great memory retrieval, it gets a tick mark on your list. If it's not good, either because you made mistakes or because you were hesitating, it doesn't get a tick mark. And you just have to go on to your next spot. So same thing, perform the next spot. If it's good, it gets a tick mark. If not, it doesn't. So you go through your list like this. Hopefully all of them are good. You get a tick mark on all of your spots. Then you go back to the start of your list and you perform spot one again. If it's good, it gets another tick mark. If it's not good, I think I made, oh, the first one not good. Okay. If it's not good, you lose any tick marks you have on that spot. You go back to 0. The goal, and then you just have to go on to your next spot. The goal with this exercise is 5 tick marks per spot. So you're going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is a great test of your memory. When you do this, you want your list to have at least 5 spots, but no more than like 10, because it will just take too long if you have 10. The reason you need at least 5 is, okay, you've played spot 1, it was great. Now you're going to do spots 2, 3, 4, 5. When you get back to 1, you haven't done it in a minute, right? Because you've been doing the other spots. And so it's a better test of your memory because you had an opportunity to forget about it and you have to kind of come up with it from scratch. If you just have 2 spots and you're going back and forth between them, it doesn't work as well because you don't have really an opportunity to forget about either one. So this works really, really well for testing retrieval. Something else that I like to do to test retrieval is random order practice. So this is a picture of the Google random number generator. So I divide my piece into sections, make sure they make musical sense. Tell Google how many total sections you have, 10, and then say generate, and Google will tell you which section to play from memory, section 3. So when you do this, don't look at your music to figure out what section 3 is. Try to figure out from memory what is section 3, and then start there. Can you just do section 3 like out of the blue, off the bat, just like that? If you cannot remember what section 3 is, you just literally, you have no idea, you've gone through from the beginning, you can't remember, don't look at your music. Go turn on a recording and see if that will help you remember what section 3 sounds like, and then try to go play it. If that doesn't work, then okay, you can look at your music. But looking at your music will give you too much information too quickly, and it isn't really a good test. So try not to look at your music. I also do a lot of different things with interval timers. This is for normal practice, but especially for testing retrieval. So the way I do this to test retrieval is an interval timer, if you don't know what it is a timer that will go off repeatedly rather than just once. There's lots of interval timer apps. They're supposed to be used for high intensity interval training, but I use them for practicing instead. So I will set my interval timer usually to go off, say, every 5 to 7 minutes. And I will have picked out usually one spot that I really want to test my memory on. So I start practicing something completely different, start my interval timer. After 5 minutes, the timer goes off. I stop what I'm practicing. I test my memory on the spot I've picked out, and then I go back to whatever I was practicing. 5 minutes later, timer goes off again, test my memory again. So this simulates just doing it cold, right? Like you're going to have to do in a performance. Sometimes I combine the interval timer with the random order. So the timer goes off, I stop what I'm doing, Google gives me a number, Google says section 5, okay, perform section 5, go, okay, now go back to what I'm practicing. So sometimes I do these together, but testing retrieval like this out of order without looking at your music is a great way to see, do you actually know it, yes or no? Oops. Okay, last thing about retrieval is to use mental practice. We didn't talk about mental practice really today, but essentially mental practice, if you've never done it before, is imagining yourself playing it in your mind. Can you hear it in your mind? Can you feel yourself play it in your mind? For pianists, can you see the keyboard? Because the visual aspect, right, is really important for you guys. But can you do it all in your mind? The research on mental practice is very clear that when people do both mental and physical practice as part of their just regular practice regimen, it's far better than only mental practice or only physical practice. We tend to think anything that's not actually actively playing the instrument is not practice. But if you're not using mental practice, you are leaving so much progress on the table because the research is really clear. Mental practice is a great way to test if you actually know it. So can you hear the whole thing in your mind without looking at your music? Can you feel yourself playing it without looking at the music? For pianists, you guys tend to neglect the left hand, right? You know what the right hand's doing, the left hand, what's going on down there? Make sure you really know what that left hand is doing. For me as a string player, it's the bottom of notes of chords that we don't know what's happening down there. But I always make sure that I can play through from beginning to end in my mind and hear the whole thing and feel the whole thing and know that I know I exactly all the notes and how to play them and that I can feel them. And once I can do that, even though like I said I memorize really easily, once I can do the whole thing like that and I feel very confident that I can do the whole thing in my mind, then I feel really good that yep, I definitely have this thing memorized. Um Okay, very last thing I want to say about memory is talking about something called choking. I know that everybody's worst fear is being super prepared and then getting off stage and going utterly blank and like not even knowing your name anymore. Um, so if you do even one thing that we've talked about today, your likelihood of choking will go down drastically. To define choking, if you don't know what it means, because this is a sports term, I feel, more than a musician term, but choking is defined as not performing up to your potential, your ability, despite having the skill and preparation to do so. So if you're not prepared and you don't play well, that is not choking, you're not prepared. If you're trying to perform something that is too hard for you and you mess up, that is also not choking. You don't have the ability to do that. But if it's within your ability level and you're well prepared and you still mess up, that's what's known as choking. So there's been two hypotheses as to what causes choking. One is that choking is caused by distraction, that, the audience is there and there's noise and things distracting you, and so you can't really concentrate very well, and that's why you choke. The other hypothesis is that it's due to something called explicit monitoring, that you basically what's the word I want? That you micromanage every little thing and you kind of second guess yourself and you're like, are you sure that's the note here, right? And you kind of micromanage every aspect of it. What research has found is that choking under pressure is mostly due to this micromanaging, thinking explicitly about things that should be automatic. I think we all kind of know that, right? That we get on stage and we have that really annoying self-talk. So I think we also all know that when that happens, it does not work to just be like brain stop. Like if it was that easy to be like, well, stop micromanaging, then none of us would have a problem with it. The brain really does not do well when we tell it not to do something. It has to be told what to do instead. I liken this to little kids. Again, any of you that have little kids in your life knows if a little kid is misbehaving and you tell them to stop, a lot of times they won't. But if you give them something else to do that's much more enticing than the thing that they were doing, they'll start doing that new thing, right? Because they're distracted by it. Our brains are the same. So, research has found a couple of things about choking. One is we're much less likely to choke if we're thinking about big picture things. So for us as musicians, this is sound, phrasing, expression. What do you want the audience to be experiencing? These big picture musical things. If you think about those things, your brain can't also be doing this micromanaging, and you're essentially distracting your brain with something way more interesting than micromanaging, and then you're much less likely to choke. We're also much less likely to choke if we practice video recording ourselves in practice to get used to being watched, to get used to being monitored. You have to practice being videoed while doing these big picture thinking things. Because if you haven't practiced with that kind of thinking, your brain's not going to trust that it's going to work when you get on stage. So you need to decide, what do I want to be thinking about? Athletes, especially like gymnasts and skaters, they talk about that do like routines that they have rehearsed. They talk about the importance of having a mental script when they perform, that there's a script going on in their mind to help keep them focused so they don't get distracted by the audience, by their nerves, whatever. We as musicians tend not to talk about that. But if you have a mental script, so you know what you want to be focusing on at any given moment using these big picture things, your brain is much less likely to go off and do something unhelpful. And if it does go off and do something unhelpful, you can bring it right back to where you want it because you have decided this is what I'm going to think about. Okay, that was a lot of information. So I have take-home messages for you to summarize everything. The first slide is take-home messages specifically about memorization, and then sort of more big picture take-home messages. So The take-home message is about memorization. Study your score and practice using your performance cues, right? Do your deep encoding. You do your chunking. Chunk your information as much as you can. This, a lot of times, is work away from the instrument, and it feels like, well, that's not actually practice. Yes, it is. It's really, really important. Get enough sleep. If you take nothing else away from today, let's take that away. Get enough sleep. Practice what you're trying to memorize last in the day and first thing the next morning for those parts that you just cannot remember. That was that strategic thing that we talked about. Practice playing from memory early in the learning process, right? So you can test your brain. Use interleaved practice to test your memory. Test muscle memory, auditory memory, and declarative memory separately, so they're all equally strong for you. Use mental practice to test retrieval. Practice playing from memory while thinking about big picture things, right? Phrasing, sound, and not technique or specific notes. Video record yourself playing from memory often, and perform from memory often for others before a concert or an audition, right? Get used to playing in front of people, do mock auditions, mock performances. So those are the takeaways from the memorization conversation. More big picture takeaways. The brain only knows what you repeat or reinforce, right? This is the pathways conversation. So always asking that question, what am I reinforcing? Which pathway am I using by how I'm practicing right now? There's the question I got ahead of myself. So take lots of breaks, the more the better. The brain really, really, really needs those. Prioritize sleep. There's a reason why it's on both slides, because it's really, really important. Learn music as holistically as you can. So the brain really likes context, right? That's, again, this is not just for memory, but sort of in general. Learn it as holistically as possible. Oops. And then one step at a time. I know that I have thrown a boatload of information at you today, and some of you, maybe all of you, are feeling a little overwhelmed, like, oh my God, I have to do a whole bunch of new things all at once. How am I going to do this? Don't try to do that. That's not sustainable. Pick one thing you heard today that you feel like, ooh, this sounds fun. This sounds exciting. I'd like to try that. And just incorporate that one new thing into your practicing. Once that is part of your practicing, then you can try incorporating something else. But if you do one thing at a time, you'll be much happier than if you try to overhaul the entire thing all at once. You don't have to change everything overnight. So that is the end of what I want to share with you. I'm going to stop my screen share so we can talk. So with a group of this size, usually the way it works best to do the Q&A is to either type your question in the chat, and I'll just go in order and read them out and answer them. I think someone is unmuted. If you want to check that, just so you don't share anything with us you maybe don't want to. You can type your question in the chat, or if you don't want to type it out, you can type in the chat, I have a question, and I will call on you to unmute, and then you can just ask me your question. But that tends to help it be more organized with a group of this size. So I'd love to know what questions you have for me.
Please don't be shy.
I know it's sort of a fire hose of information. I have a question. Caitlin, go ahead.
Hi. So my question is, recently I've been trying to improve my practice routines because I get distracted very easily. So
Hmm.
I had like ChatGPT help me create like a practice schedule, and then I write out like detailed what I do. But I've found also sometimes that it's not quite as helpful as I want, and I'm still kind of feeling like I'm not accomplishing as much as I would like. Do you have like a formatting, almost like a lesson plan or something, or how do you go about that when you're actually like looking at a piece or studying or practicing?
Yeah, great question. So a couple things. One is this is something I do at the beginning of learning something new, but it continues throughout the whole process, is I assign different sections, but a section could be a single measure even. Red, yellow, and green in my music. So red sections are emergencies. If I had to play this for someone right now, I would fall on my face, like absolute like disaster. So those are red sections. And like I said, sometimes it's just a single measure. Yellow sections are things that need work, but they aren't disasters. And usually you can differentiate between those pretty easily. And then green sections are parts that, like, sure, maybe I want to practice them more, but if I had to perform them or play them for somebody right now, I wouldn't embarrass myself, that they would be like, okay. So I divide my music into red, yellow, green. And then the red sections are obviously my priorities. And so that's where I start. The red sections are also going to take the most brain power to practice because they're the hardest and they need the most attention. So I interleave red sections with green sections. So I will work on a red section for at most 10 minutes. 10, 12 minutes. And then I will usually go work on a green section for like 3, 4 minutes. And then maybe I'll go back to the first red section, or maybe I'll do a different red section and come back to that first one later. It kind of depends where I am in my work. But that's how I sort of divide up a given practice session and I decide what to work on. Um, in terms of like within a given section, what exactly I do, at the end of each practice session and practice day, I write in my practice journal what needs work. Because at the end of a practice session, it's the most fresh what isn't working, right? So at the end of the practice session, I just jot down some quick notes, things that I noticed in the practice session that aren't working or I ran out of time to work on. So I have those, and then the next day when I come back, that's what I start with. We didn't talk about the importance of setting goals, but it's really important to have very specific goals for your practice session. And so having those spots written down in my practice journal, those are my goals for the next day. I find that people tend to, when they're practicing, have a hard time either breaking things down into steps or figuring out how to implement their goals or keep their time organized or not practice mindlessly. Anyway, something that really helps all of those things is to talk out loud to yourself. So more specifically, talk out loud to some sort of little friend so you feel like you're talking to somebody. Um, but before you start practicing, describe to your little stuffed animal what you're going to be practicing, why you're practicing it, and what your goal is, and describe it as if your little stuffed animal doesn't play your instrument. So you have to, put in enough detail so they can understand. And then while you're practicing, also talk out loud. When something works, describe, okay, I was just able to do that and I was able to do it because of XYZ. Or if something didn't go well, say out loud, okay, I just messed that up. I think it didn't work because of this reason. Here's what I'm going to try to fix that. Then you try it and then you say, okay, that didn't quite work the way I thought, but now I think I'll add this. So when you talk out loud, it really helps organize your thoughts better. People find that they're able to think more clearly, they're able to organize their practice better, and they don't waste as much time that way. So hopefully that answers your question and gives you some ideas of things to do. People always want a practice, like, yeah, like a lesson plan that like you can just like download, plug and play. It does not work that way. Practicing is active problem solving in the moment. I don't know what I'm going to practice tomorrow until I've practiced today and I see what I did today and I see what issues I solved today and what issues came up today. And then that's what determines what I'm going to practice tomorrow. I know what I'm going to practice tomorrow because I finished my practicing for the day, but I definitely don't know what I'm practicing on Wednesday because I have to practice tomorrow to see what happens tomorrow to see what work needs to be done on Wednesday. So the issue with using something like ChatGPT, that's a bigger conversation. I'm so anti-AI, like it's unbelievable. But the problem with using something like that is it's not active problem solving in the moment, which is why it's not working as well for you because it's not actually addressing the issues that you have that you notice happening in the moment. So hopefully that answers your question and gives you some ideas.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions people have? Yes, Hannah wrote, how would abnormal synaptic pruning, such as with autism, affect reinforcement of skills or weakening of bad habits? Great question. Autistic individuals have more connections and more synapses talking to each other in the brain. It doesn't really affect the reinforcement of skills or weakening of bad habits in any way that is sort of relevant to learning an instrument. With the things we talked about today, something that can be different for autistic individuals is autistic individuals really like to know the plan, right? They like to know what the plan is and that things are predictable. Autistic individuals really tend not to like it when there are surprises and things that are unplanned. Autistic individuals also tend not to like switching between things really often. So interleaved practice, I sometimes get questions about that. Like, if I'm autistic, I don't like that. I like to do things in a block. I get that. I really love to do block practice too. But if you have made a plan of how you're going to interleave between things and the switching is predicted and predictable, that makes it much easier for someone who's autistic who has trouble switching between things to actually implement that because it's part of the plan. You're just sort of carrying out the plan, and it's in a nice structure that you have sort of put together. But the other thing that can happen with autistic individuals is also with the taking breaks. And again, if it's planned, it's fine. If it's unplanned, that's when it can feel like, oh, I don't like this. So yeah, autistic individuals like structures and plans. And so making sure that that's part of the process. But the synaptic pruning that is different in autistic brains versus neurotypical brains, that doesn't really show up that much as far as I've seen in the research with reinforcing bad habits or weakening bad habits or things like that. Um, Hopefully that answers that question. Other questions people have. Julian has a question. Go ahead, Julian.
There, sorry, I had to mute myself.
You're good.
I've noticed that as a singer, I have a very relatively easy time memorizing the music of a piece. So getting the melody into my ear and like holding on to that. But lyrics, particularly lyrics in a language I don't speak, that ends up taking a much longer time for me to get in, whether I learn the lyrics separately and then add them to the music or try to learn them together. I find I tend to really get caught up in lyric learning. I was wondering, like, is it an issue of like thinking of the two of them as a piece and just kind of overloading what I'm trying to memorize, or by having them being split apart, like should they be thought of as like learning two things and putting them together, or is this like learning it holistically? Like what I'm kind of losing track of my question. Like how would you kind of like think about approaching that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. So I think it's important to learn it both holistically and separately, which I know is not a very satisfying answer. I think the biggest issue that I have observed, anyways, with singers learning text, especially when they're not in your native language, is falls on that encoding side of things because you don't really understand what you're saying. The sounds you are making with your mouth feel a little bit random because they don't have meaning in the way it would if it was in English, or whatever your native language is. Um, and so if you do more deep encoding of really understanding not only what do the words mean, but like the emotional import of them and all that stuff, the more you do that kind of really deep encoding with the text, that will help you remember it. To your question of are you sort of overloading your brain by trying to do too much at once? Potentially. I mean, if you're singing, especially in a language you don't sing in frequently, let's say Russian or something like that, and you're trying to do a whole phrase at once, notes and text, that's way too much. Your brain is not going to be able to handle that. But if make it really small and you just learn a measure, let's say, of notes and text, or half a measure of notes and text, that is something that your brain can hold on to. And that you can learn more successfully. I would do a lot of interleaving. So maybe you have decided, you're going to learn text of this song and you're going to do text and music together and you're just going to focus on one measure. Okay, can I do that? Great. Go work on something else, then test your memory just on that measure, and put it together in little segments like that. That being said, something that's really important for singers is can you sing the tune? Can you hum the tune without the text? can you recite the text without the tune? Those are different ways of practicing retrieval that are really important. In my book that Blair showed you guys at the beginning, I'll show it to you again. Here's my book. It in the append one of the appendices, there are a whole bunch of what are called variable practice methods that are specific to instruments. It's Appendix C. And there are a whole ton that are specific to singers, both for learning text and combining text with singing. Those were written by a vocal coach, so not me, who has a lot of experience learning with helping singers, working with singers and helping them memorize. So that's, yeah, my book is available on Amazon, Barnes& and Noble, bookshop.org, wherever you get books online, from the publisher, Oxford University Press, and also on Audible. It's an audiobook. So all of the suggestions back there would be things to do also to help you learn the text, help you do deep encoding of the text, and help you sort of test yourself in different ways. Hopefully that gives you some ideas to work with. Abby has a question. Go ahead.
Hi, I am also a singer, and I am curious about how you've incorporated these practices into warming up. My first reaction to like hearing the different, like, having different times throughout the day is like, will I have to warm up every time, and how long it takes to warm up? Like, there can be times where it takes me 20 minutes to warm up, which is the entire practice session. And so then I'm curious about, the balance of how you incorporate both the like exploratory and repetitive parts into warming up in terms of like wanting to like be able to prepare to practice every time while also like thinking of the warm up as part of practicing and learning.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. So I think it's really important to be very clear with yourself the difference between warming up and working on technique, because we tend to conflate the two of these. That warming up and technical work are one and the same, but they are not. Warming up is literally getting your body warm and ready to do the thing that you're going to do, sing, play, whatever. Um, for singers, my guess is you need longer to warm up first thing in the morning because you haven't used your voice yet, right? And so that is going to be a longer warm up. Whereas if you've practiced in the morning and you practice again in the afternoon, you don't need to literally physically warm up your body as much because you've been using it. Um, so yeah, I think it's important to be very clear with yourself the distinction. Am I literally getting myself warm, or am I working on, in your case, my vocal technique? If you're working on your actual technique and you're trying to get better at it, then you need to treat it just like working on repertoire. You need to interleave it. You need to take breaks from it. Warming up is different. I also think it's important for all of us to figure out how to warm up quickly, because sometimes you don't have time for a big long warm up. When I was in grad school, I felt that literally I could not play well unless I had warmed up for half an hour. That if I didn't have half an hour to warm up, like I was not able to play. But I would very often have like quartet rehearsal right after a class, and I'd have like 5 minutes, if that, to warm up. And I wouldn't have my half hour warm up, and I felt like I couldn't play. And I realized, like, okay, this is not sustainable. Like in a professional environment, I'm not always going to have half an hour to warm up. And so I really had to think very carefully, okay, what will get me warmed up fast enough that I can play in a rehearsal successfully, or that I can get myself warmed up quickly and then practice with the little bit of time that I may have. I had a half hour warm up routine that was great, but I had to really pare it down. I have a 5 minute warm up routine now, if that's all the time I have. If I have more time, I warm up for longer, but I have a 5 minute thing that I had to experiment with that does get me warmed up. So if you feel like warming up takes the entire practice session, maybe it does in the morning, like your first practice session that you do, but really asking yourself, do you truly need all that time to get physically warm, later when you practice again? My guess is the answer is no to that. And then, yeah, distinguishing between what is actual literal warming up and what is technique work to improve your vocal technique. Anything that's to improve your vocal technique, you want to take breaks from it, you want to interleave it. Like I was saying, practicing it literally like anything else. Hopefully that answers that question about warming up versus technique.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Um, any other questions? I just noticed the time though. But I can hang out for a little bit longer if people have other questions they want to ask. But you guys have a performance in an hour, right? So you probably have to go, or you just have something.
Yeah, we have our first master class in an hour. But so first of all, I just want to say thank you, Dr. Gebrian. This has been truly tremendous, and it was really heartening to hear, for example, your answer to Julian's question. I am a French vocal coach, so that is usually the work that I do with singers with French music is I have them recite the poem separately from the music. But the important aspect, which you really just help enforce or I guess cement my belief, is that you have to look at it separate from the music and then be able to hum the tune, thinking of maybe the lyrics. But also the other aspect is if it's not your native language, you need to be able to recite that in your native language.
Yes.
So that it still has meaning. So it was wonderful to hear all that kind of come together, at least from a neuroscience, because it cemented that, okay, this has been working, at least anecdotally with my students for the past, 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
So I like hearing that, because when I read your book, one of the other things that I kind of had as a competitive gymnast growing up, I was told that what you think and what you actually do, the brain doesn't really know the difference. And then when I read your book, you actually said, no, that's actually not true. And I thought, well, that's kind of false knowledge that it had my entire, at least as a gymnast, my entire competitive career. Because I thought, well, if I think it, it's pretty much the same as me doing it. So I do want to at least just point out to anyone who's still here with us that there is a wonderful course on Dr. Gebrian's website. So if this is information that you feel like, well, I just kind of like hit the tip of the iceberg, you can continue to go deeper. Obviously, you want to investigate either the audible version of the book or reading the book. But then once you've done that, if you're still hungry for more, she offers mini courses. And I think maybe you can just explain quickly what's the difference between your mini course and then the longer version of your course.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll put my website, there's my website in the chat. So I have a whole bunch of stuff online. I have a full-length self-paced course that you can take sort of at your own pace. It's videos and then sort of worksheets to help you implement the various practice things that are talked about. I also have a live online course that I'll probably be teaching next in the fall, and that is live online, so it's sort of more interactive. We actually have an opportunity to try out different practice methods in the class with everybody kind of on mute, trying things out with conversation. And then I have a bunch of mini courses, which is the big, long, self-paced course broken into topics. So if there's only one or two topics you want to learn about, you don't have to buy the whole thing. You can just buy, those topics and do those topics. I also have like so many free resources on my website if you don't want to pay for anything, or you're a student and you have no money. I know that well. So on my website, specifically on the Music and the Brain page, there are a ton of videos on the science of practicing. There are podcasts where I've been a guest. There are things you can download. I'll also give you my YouTube, where I have a whole bunch of videos that are also on my website, but sometimes people like to go directly to YouTube. I have a newsletter that comes out on the 1st, the 11th, and the 21st of each month, and it's one quote, usually from my book, one question to ask yourself about practicing, and then one practice tip. So it's super short and sweet. I hate newsletters. I don't have time to read them. But there's one that I read every time it comes because it's really short and sweet and useful like that. So I wanted to do something like that. So if that's interesting, you can sign up on my website. I also do offer one-on-one practice coaching. If there's something that came up today and you want to talk more specifically about your specific challenges, just send me an email. I will put my email in the chat. And we can set up a time to talk, just us. So yeah, that's me. Thank you for having me today. It's been great to be
Oh,
here and
thank you.
with all
Thank
of
you
you.
so much. This has been truly a wonderful, wonderful afternoon, a wonderful presentation. We're very grateful. It's very thought-provoking and illuminating the resources and information that you've been. And I have to say, if you're a singer or pianist still on, in the book, Dr. Gebrian did say this, there are specific, toward the end, specific recommendations for pianists and for singers, as Dr. Gebrian said, and I find that information was very, very useful and very, very pertinent. So be sure, if you do get the book, to check that out. I just want to thank Dr. Gebrian again, and I certainly would like to have you back, and maybe we can do something specifically on the blocking and interleaved practice, because I didn't get much to that, get into that too much today. But again, you'll always have a place here at the Art Song Preservation Society. So thank you so much for your time today. And thank you, singers and pianists, and any guests who joined us as well. I look forward to seeing everyone at the Performance Readiness Masterclass in Mikowski Hall with Elizabeth Stevens later today. So thank you, Dr. Gebrian, and thank you, everyone who joined.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good rest of your festival.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Yay.